Next, our first featured speaker for the afternoon session will be Dr. Ramrani Yvette Rosser. Dr. Yvette Claire Rosser, who was given the name Ramrani by her guru Neem Karoli Baba. She is an American writer and scholar who self-identifies as Hindu. Dr. Rosser has investigated the ubiquitous Hinduphobic bias that is found in secondary level social studies textbooks used in American classrooms. She has taught Westerners, especially teachers, the basics of Hinduism. You can find her research at YvetteRosser.com. Her PhD dissertation, Curriculum as Destiny, Forging National Identities in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, is a study of the politics of history in South Asia. The book, Islamization of Pakistani Social Studies Textbooks, grew out of her dissertation study. Rosser is currently working on her next book titled The Politicization of India's Historiography. Please welcome on screen Dr. Ramrani Yvette Rosser.
Hello, namaste. Thank you for inviting me here to the conference on Hinduphobia, sponsored by the Hindu Students Council. It's a very important topic, and identifying and combating Hinduphobia in academia is something that I've been interested in for about 30 years. You may say, how did she have 30 years talking about Hinduphobia? And I can tell you a little bit of my history, my biography. When I was 18 years old, I arrived in India without having planned to be there. I just was hitchhiking around Europe. My mother sent me to Europe for a high school graduation present, and I just was somehow ended up in India. And I've often said it's just pichadi janam ki cheez hai, because it must have been just like past life thing, you know. Suddenly I'm in India. I didn't have much money, and immediately I met Goenka. I met S.N. Goenka, who taught Vipassana meditation, and I took meditation courses, and I loved it. It was like washing all the past away, and then very luckily I met my guru named Karoli Baba, and this really solved a lot of my problems, because as a child I had kind of fallen away from Christianity because it didn't make sense to me. I had so many problems with it. My mother was a Roman Catholic and my father was a Southern Baptist, and so I used to think that I covered both ends of the spectrums. I mean, I can't be more Christian than that. And then one day I was at vacation Bible school at my grandparents' house, and they passed a cup around to save the souls of the poor little papist children. And I didn't raise my hand and say, hi, I'm a papist. I knew that papist was an insult for Catholicism. And so I got home and I asked my mother, how come the Baptists think the Catholics are going to hell? And she said, well, the Catholics also think the Baptists are going to hell. So I was stunned. It didn't make sense. You know, Jesus loves us all. We're all going to heaven forever and ever with him. And so then I had a dream about this pygmy in deepest, darkest Africa. He lived in a tree. And I didn't know anything about pygmies or Africa, but it was a dream after all. And he did such good things for the community. He was like a healer and loving and caring and giving things, and just like Jesus. And so I went to catechism class and I asked the nun, I told her about the dream and my pygmy, and I said, he'll go to heaven when he dies, won't he? He was such a good guy. He never sinned, and he was loving and caring and generous. And she said, well, is he a Christian? I said, no, he never had a chance to become a Christian. She said, well, then he has to go to hell. And she said, nowadays there's roads everywhere, there's churches everywhere. I said, no, he lived in Africa. She said, well, I'm sorry, if he's not a Christian, he can't go to heaven. So then I started to cry. And she, I guess, took pity on me, said he can go to purgatory until Jesus comes back on the day of glory, second coming, and then he'll take him up to heaven with him. Well, I wasn't satisfied with this. And so I went back to my mother and we talked about it for a while, and she said that I could become an agnostic if I wanted to be. And I didn't, and so she explained what that was. And so then I kind of started reading the beat poets, Allen Ginsberg, and I found Thomas Merton, but I was too young to really understand all this. And then within a couple of years, I was in India, and I recognized it. I remember so well the first day I crossed into India. It's like I knew I'd been there before. And then one day, my guru called me to him. He said, Ramrani, that's the name he gave me, Ramrani. And he said, when you go back to America, go to the university and study about India and help to make Hinduism better understood and respected. So then I had a mission in life. So when I went back to America, I went to the University of Texas at Austin, and in 1975, and I got a degree in Indian civilization and literature. And one of my professors was Raja Rao. He was an Indian author, a Vaishya Vedantist. He wrote his first book in English. He's from Karnataka, but he wrote a book in English called Kantapura in 1938. And he's written other books, The Serpent and the Rope and Shakespeare and the Cat, and he was my mentor, a really sweet man. And I'm still friends with his wife. He's passed on now. But anyway, so after I got my degree with honors at the University of Texas, my BA, I got married and had kids, and so I knew I had to go to graduate school if I was going to fulfill Maharaji's command to me to make Hinduism better understood and respected. So I waited until my kids were older. In that meantime, I taught high school, and I was teaching world history, and the chapter on India in the world history textbooks was just full of mistakes and bias and prejudice. They talked about every page had a picture of untouchables and carrying a human excrement on their head, and every other paragraph was just all about, you'd think that was only untouchability in India. And even they talked about sati and infanticide and pollution and population, and it was just like this terrible picture of India in the textbook. And it's like, you wouldn't want to go there at all, I mean, how can these people stand to live there? And what is this pagan religion? I didn't talk anything about the things the way that I understood Hinduism. So I thought, after my kids are a little bit older, I'll go to graduate school and I'll do an analysis of the high school history textbooks on India and see if we can't change that. So then, one example of a page in the textbook, there was a man with a little beanie on his head, and his hands were like this in prayer, obviously a Muslim gentleman offering namaz, and the caption said, a Brahmin offering prayers. So, I mean, even that little bitty mistakes is just common. It's an example of all the mistakes that you find throughout. And another page that was really interesting is there are these two pictures of these medieval-looking warriors or something. I don't know what they were. They didn't look very Hindu to me. And it said the main gods of India. And then one was Varuna and one was Indra. I thought, Varuna and Indra? Who's making this stuff up? I never heard of, I never went to an Indra Mandir. I mean, where's Hanuman and Ganesh and Ram and Krishna? And so these textbooks are going to change. They talk about sati, they talk about infanticide, they talk about all the negative things. And the other textbooks on Christianity, they didn't talk about witch burning. I mean, they didn't talk about the negative stuff. And I'm sure you need to know about the negative things in a country, but not when you're a child, because many of these people, these students, they'll never study about India in another context. So this class that they took in their junior high area period is the only time they'll ever learn about India. And if it's just all this negative stuff, then they'll never know anything but that. And so anyway, after my kids got a little bit older, I started graduate school in January 1993. Which is exactly 5 weeks after the Babri Masjid was destroyed. And when I got to the Department of South Asian Studies at the University of Texas, I found the faculty that was verging on anti-Hinduism. I was shocked. And I called it anti-Hindu bias. Everybody had an anti-Hindu bias, except a couple of people didn't. Like Raja Rao, of course, he didn't. And Dr. Van Opelen taught Hindi. There was a few people who were like above that. And but the people who taught about Hinduism and the historians, they had this anti-Hindu bias, and they thought Hinduism was kind of like Nazism, and you had to discourage it. For example, they told me to never write anything that would uphold or glorify the Hindu myth of the golden age of Hinduism. You don't want to encourage the fundamentalists, the Hindu nationalists, or whatever, and so. Like there's an archaeological discovery off the coast of Gujarat that they found an underground city. I mean, underwater, they found a city like a port city, Dwarka. And the carbon-14 dating verified that it was thousands of years old. And the professors didn't want to talk about that very much because they didn't want to talk about anything that would promote the golden age of Hinduism because it encourages Hindu nationalists. And they would rather ignore incredible archaeological discoveries which might be used by Hindus to support their ideas of the ancient historical status of Hinduism. And no other culture is treated like that. Denying scientifically verified discoveries because they would be used to prove the ancientness theory of Hinduism. So instead we're told to blindly accept the biblical dating, the time frame based by European Indologists in the 18th century. Professors told me that I couldn't be a Hindu. I couldn't study Hinduism if I was a Hindu. They're not telling Muslims they can't study Islam if they're Muslim. Christians can study Christianity, but Hindus, they don't want Hindus to study Hinduism because they teach it wrong, and Hindus would be objecting all the time. And anyway, so they told me that I should embrace my Christian roots. I shouldn't be a Hindu. And they would never tell a Hindu he couldn't be a Christian if he converted to Christianity. So it's like this hypocrisy. So now when I first started graduate school, I wanted to investigate and chronicle the many biases and mistakes about India that I found in the secondary level textbooks. I thought professors of Hindu studies would be very disturbed by these problems, and that were so rampant in the high school curriculum, and that perpetuated this bias and the stereotyping. But instead, the professor said, well, that's the way we've always represented Hinduism academically. And again, I was warned not to do anything that could lend credence to the ancientness theories of Hinduism, promote the Hindu nationalists, or support the golden age of Hinduism. Now this is interesting how they use the presentism, the politics of the present, to analyze the ancient past. Completely not a very good historical strategy. So I found myself in a very tricky situation and realized that in order to eliminate the bias about Hinduism in secondary level textbooks, I would have to find another route. So in 2006, a few years after I graduated in my PhD, I found that there's a process in California where they reevaluate the textbooks, and different people can look at it, because in sixth grade textbooks they teach all the religions of the world, your world cultures. And so Muslims came in to evaluate the chapter on Islam, and Christians were evaluating the chapter on Christianity, and Jews were evaluating the chapter on Judaism, and some people were working with me to evaluate the chapter on Hinduism. So we were progressing quite nicely and making some changes, trying to get the infanticide out of there, and the sati, and every page wasn't just caste system, was every single paragraph. I wanted to, because India is not just the caste system, there are other things there. And then right towards the end of our process, it was several months long process, suddenly there came this hysterical letter from a professor at Harvard University. His name was Michael Witzel. And he warned the California Textbook Board that the people representing Hinduism were fascists and murderers, and the textbook board should reject our editorial suggestions carte blanche. And so it really freaked out the textbook board. And so they wanted to reject they'd already accepted all of our editorial suggestions, and they suddenly rejected them because this Harvard professor on letterhead had told them, they'd met with us several times. We didn't seem like fascists to them. But then Michael Witzel brought in all these Indians that were living in Colorado Springs, which is Indian Christians, and he brought them in to speak against the editorial suggestions we had made about Hinduism. And these are Indian Christians, and they're biased against the Hindu narrative anyway. These particular ones were. And so the textbook board didn't know that they were Christians. They weren't Hindu. And so this is like, manipulation of the situation. So we got to keep some of our editorial suggestions, but it was really kind of a shock that this happened. No other scholars, nobody wrote letters to the Jewish scholars and accused them of horrible treachery. They didn't write letters no one wrote letters about the Islamic scholars who were working on the books. They weren't accused of all this, baby killing and things. So anyway, one of the things, the red lights, the flag that the scholars don't like at all is if you question the Aryan invasion theory. Now, inherent in the word is theory. So these are the Aryan invasion theory. And if you try to show the other side of the theory, that's not just one side of the theory, all of a sudden, that's a Hindu nationalist perspective. So if you question the Aryan invasion theory, you're obviously a Hindu nationalist, and you probably kill babies. And so anyway, now the textbooks in California are reviewed every 10 years. So between 2006 and 2016, a group of professors, including Michael Witzel and Kamala Vishwaswaran, made themselves ready they had a little committee, an organization that they made in order to spring into action to head off the work of Hindus to try to remove the bias against Hinduism in the next section in 2016. And so in 2016 came around, and before we could even do anything, they were already there ahead of us, and they insisted that these professors insisted that the words India and Hinduism be eliminated from the textbooks. Instead of India, we're supposed to put South Asia, and instead of Hinduism, we're supposed to put religion of South Asia. And so it's just really an awkward sort of sentence when everything's South Asia, South Asia, South Asia, and can't use the word India or Hinduism. And the textbook board was kind of listening to these people because they've had Harvard stationery and all this, and then luckily a group of 30 professors wrote a letter to the textbook board and said, it's ridiculous, you have to use the word India. But so the argument was that there's no India, that was invented by the British, and there's no Hinduism, it was invented by the Muslims to draw a distinction against them. And but then luckily these other 30 professors, they won the day, and we were able to keep the word Hinduism and the word India in the textbooks. But this is the kind of crazy problems that Hindus have in order to work in the academic world and to try to eradicate bias against their religious tradition. So to me, when these 30 professors wrote this letter in defense of the Hindus, it showed a change. It was a sea change. All of a sudden, professors were taking our side, and I hope it's something to come. I hope it's a sign of the future that Hindus are not derided. Other people, if Hindus can study Hinduism, but not in academia. They don't want Hindus in their classrooms, and so this is now a new thing. Hopefully, Hinduism will be more accepted. A bit more. Insiders will have a voice. That's the thing that's missing in the study of Hinduism. It's like the insiders don't have a voice, and when they do try to speak up, they're like derided or insulted and called the Nazis and stuff. And so anyway, in my master's study, which you can see on the internet, I have it at YvetteRosser.com, and it's a study about, I looked at textbooks from the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. And the textbooks in the 60s were kind of like Disneyland. They said things like, American families can go to India, it's like great for tourism, the architecture's so lovely, there's cows in the street, and the mountains are beautiful, and it just kind of, and they did talk about untouchables and stuff, but it wasn't as bad. But then in the 70s, it was all about untouchability, and it was all negative, and then and they even said, you can't trust India because sometimes at the United Nations, they vote with the Soviet Union, so they're not really our friend. And this is like using the presentism, using politics of the present moment to analyze the ancient past. And so in the 80s, it was more intellectual. Actually, the best books were published in the 80s. They weren't quite so bad as some of the other ones. But then by the 90s, that's when they had I don't know if I lost my time frame. 60s was the Disneyland, 70s was where you voted for the Soviet Union, 80s was okay, and the 90s were when they used postmodernism, and and it kind of turned India doesn't even exist, you know. And so one example from the textbooks I can read to you. The textbook tells the students that, quote, moral conduct was unimportant to the Aryans. However, it's easy to see that it's refuted by many Sanskrit eulogies to noble and virtuous character. The book explains that rituals consisted of pouring juice of soma and liquid butter into the sacred fire. The significant statement says, the good qualities of the person performing the puja does not matter. This seems to indicate that Brahmins were not bestowed with adequately good qualities, when in fact, according to Vedic tradition, Brahmins were held to a stricter moral code than other strata of society. They had to be in a state of ritual purity to perform the ceremonies, and that included proper conduct. Statements such as this reinforce the perception that moral conduct, as found in Indian philosophy, is relative and unimportant, compared to the later Semitic traditions with their clearly articulated and specific list of do's and don'ts. Hinduism can appear to have fluid views of morality when in fact there are detailed in codes of behavior. Honesty and trustworthiness are highly valued. Ultimately, there's an overall subtle academic bias against Hinduism, which will only go away by the efforts of scholars like those in attendance here today. I often ask myself why. Why this Hinduphobia in academia? And I came to realize that if Hinduism were described accurately, people would be sitting in front of their puja tables and meditating. I suppose that is a threat, and therefore there is the strange Hinduphobia, where they just want to show the negative side of Hinduism, and not bring out the really uplifting, positive, self-affirming, experiential side of Hinduism. So now I'm full circle back of that Hindu Students Council, because in 1996, when working on my master's thesis, I investigated the content on India and American social studies textbooks, and one aspect of my analysis was a survey I gave to 70 Hindu students at UT Austin, and they were members of the Hindu Students Council. I asked them to describe what they had been taught about India in their social studies text classes, and some of the answers were quite amusing. You can see it on the document on my website, YvetteRosser.com. And so here again, the Student Council, Hindu Student Council, is working to eliminate the bias and prejudice against Hinduism in academia. Congratulations. I'm so proud of you for doing this. Let's keep working on this important project, and eventually the bias will be eradicated. It took a few centuries for the biased approach to the teaching of India to become the norm, and it will take at least a generation of workers to change that narrative. But don't give up the mission. Kudos. Thank you. Ram Ram. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Dr. Rosser, for that wonderful presentation, and thank you for the shout out to Hindu Students Council. As Ramrani ji mentioned, she had conducted her research with the chapter of the Hindu Students Council at UT Austin back in the 1990s. HSC today has chapters on both college as well as high school campuses throughout the US and Canada. To learn more about Hindu Students Council, to start a chapter, or most importantly, to make a donation to support initiatives like this one, please visit www.hindustudentscouncil.org. Your support is what makes such events possible. I also want to thank Ramrani ji for all the work she did to ensure a fair representation of Hindu traditions in her curriculum as an education scholar. It was truly heartening to hear of your journey.
For the latest on our YouTube channel, click subscribe and hit the bell icon for alerts on new content. Remember to like, comment, and share our videos. For more about HSC, you can visit the social media handles listed below.